Imagine being told that your passport isn't welcome in an entire country just because you're American. Sounds shocking, right? But in 2025, this is a reality for US citizens trying to travel to certain countries. In fact, there are 10 countries where Americans are literally banned or restricted from entering. And it's not because of anything we did. It's about geopolitics, conflict, and international tensions that most of us only hear about in the news. Now, here's the kicker. Did you know that in some of these countries, Americans face arrest or even worse? And it's not just about avoiding dangerous places. Some of these restrictions could change your entire travel plans without warning. What if your dream vacation in a foreign land gets ruined because you didn't know the US was on the country's blacklist? These travel bans are more than just red tape. They're a serious risk to your safety and freedom. But why are these countries specifically banning US citizens? And how can you avoid these geopolitical landmines in 2025? Stick around, because we're about to uncover the shocking truth behind these travel restrictions and why you won't want to make the mistake of trying to visit them. Ready to find out which countries are off limits for you? Keep watching. Some of these might surprise you. Number 10. North Korea. When it comes to countries that Americans are not allowed to visit in 2025, North Korea is one of the most well-known and controversial destinations. This mysterious nation has long had strict travel restrictions, and for US citizens, it's a place you'll likely want to avoid, at least without a government-approved guide. North Korea's ban on American travelers isn't exactly new. Tensions between the US and North Korea have been high for decades, and the relationship took a serious downturn after the country's nuclear weapons tests and repeated acts of defiance against international norms. The US government has strongly discouraged travel to North Korea for years due to safety concerns, and more recently, these restrictions have only gotten tighter. For US citizens, visiting North Korea is possible, but not without significant hurdles. To enter the country legally, Americans must be accompanied by an official government-approved tour guide. This is a direct result of the North Korean regime's suspicion of foreigners, particularly Americans, who they often view as hostile. As a result, tourists are heavily monitored throughout their stay, with a strict itinerary that only includes state-approved locations. But it's not just the government's distrust that makes North Korea a dangerous destination. The country has been known to detain Americans, sometimes on vague or trumped-up charges, leading to prolonged imprisonments. One of the most infamous cases was the 2016 arrest of Otto Warmbier, a US college student who was detained for allegedly stealing a propaganda poster. He was released after 17 months, but tragically passed away shortly after returning to the US. So while North Korea's dark allure might seem intriguing to some, it's not a place that should be on your 2025 travel itinerary, unless you're prepared for potential risks that far outweigh the experience. Number 9. Iran. Iran is a country that has been in a state of tension with the United States for decades, and in 2025, it remains one of the most restricted destinations for American travelers. Political relations between the two nations have been rocky, especially following the US withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, which further soured diplomatic ties and led to an increase in travel restrictions. For US citizens, entering Iran isn't just a matter of navigating bureaucratic hurdles, it's about navigating a highly charged political landscape. While Iran isn't officially closed to Americans, the Iranian government is known for being extremely wary of foreign visitors, especially those from the US. The risk of arrest and detention is real, especially given that the Iranian government has a history of detaining Americans on dubious charges, sometimes accusing them of espionage or other crimes without concrete evidence. Travelers to Iran must also be aware of the complicated visa process. Americans wishing to visit need to apply for a visa through a travel agency that works directly with the Iranian government. This agency is required to assign a tour guide to accompany visitors throughout their stay, further tightening the level of government control on the travel experience. Any independent travel is essentially prohibited. Beyond the visa challenges and government control, there are also significant safety concerns. Protests, civil unrest, and clashes between citizens and the government have escalated in recent years, making it even more dangerous for American tourists. Additionally, tensions with the US military could make travelers targets, adding an extra layer of risk. For all these reasons, Iran is not a safe or accessible destination for US citizens in 2025. Travelers should be cautious and stay updated on any changes to travel advisories. Number 8. Syria. Syria, once a thriving and culturally rich destination, has become one of the most dangerous places in the world for travelers, especially US citizens. Due to the ongoing civil war and widespread instability, Syria remains a country that Americans are strongly advised, if not outright prohibited, from visiting in 2025. The situation in Syria has been deteriorating for over a decade. Since the outbreak of the civil war in 2011, the country has become a battleground for multiple factions, including government forces, rebel groups, and extremist organizations. The US government has consistently warned against travel to Syria due to the high risk of violence, kidnapping, and terrorist attacks. In fact, the US State Department has issued a blanket travel advisory urging all Americans to avoid the country at all costs. Why is Syria so dangerous for US citizens? First, the civil war shows no signs of abating. Armed conflict, airstrikes, and ground fighting between various groups make the country incredibly unstable. The presence of ISIS and other radical groups further heightens the threat level. Foreigners, particularly Americans, are seen as prime targets for kidnapping and ransom. Additionally, the US Embassy in Syria closed years ago, making it nearly impossible for Americans to receive consular assistance in an emergency. The lack of diplomatic support and the hostile environment create a perfect storm of risks for anyone attempting to travel to Syria. Even if someone is determined to visit, it's virtually impossible to do so legally. With closed borders and no functioning diplomatic missions, gaining entry to Syria is both dangerous and extremely difficult. In short, Syria remains one of the most perilous countries for American travelers. It's simply not a destination worth risking your safety in 2025. Number 7. Libya. Libya, once a prosperous nation in North Africa, has faced a dramatic decline into instability and chaos since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. As of 2025, it remains one of the most dangerous countries for Americans to visit, primarily due to its ongoing civil conflict and lack of a stable government. The US government has long warned against all travel to Libya, citing the country's breakdown in law and order, as well as the rise of militant groups. Since Gaddafi's ousting, Libya has been embroiled in a vicious civil war, with multiple factions fighting for control of the country. The result has been widespread violence, political instability, and an increase in terrorist activity. Various groups, including ISIS, have operated in the region, posing a serious threat to any foreign nationals who might find themselves caught in the conflict. The US State Department strongly advises Americans to avoid Libya due to the risks of kidnapping, violent crime, and being caught in crossfire between rival militias. Foreigners have been targeted by both terrorist groups and criminal organizations, and the threat of being taken hostage for ransom is a constant danger. In addition to the security risks, Libya has no functioning US embassy, as diplomatic relations remain severed. This means that, should an American citizen get into trouble, they would have no official support or resources available to help them escape or resolve the situation. For these reasons, Libya is not a country you should consider visiting in 2025. The dangers, ranging from the lack of security to the absence of diplomatic protection, far outweigh any potential benefits of travelling there. If you're planning a trip to North Africa, there are plenty of safer options to explore. Number 6. Yemen. Yemen, located at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, is a country in the midst of a humanitarian crisis and ongoing civil war. As of 2025, Yemen is one of the most dangerous countries for US citizens to visit, and the US government strongly advises against all travel to the region. The conflict in Yemen, which began in 2014, has spiraled into one of the worst humanitarian disasters in modern history. The war involves the Houthi rebels, backed by Iran, fighting against the internationally recognized government, supported by a Saudi-led coalition. The situation has led to widespread famine, disease outbreaks, and the destruction of critical infrastructure, making the country not only dangerous, but also a place where basic necessities are in short supply. For American travelers, Yemen poses significant risks. The US government has warned that the threat of terrorism, kidnapping, and violent crime is extremely high. Al-Qaeda and ISIS, two well-known terrorist groups, are active in the region, and foreigners, particularly Americans, are seen as high-value targets. The risk of being abducted and held for ransom is real, with numerous reports of foreign nationals being taken hostage in recent years. Additionally, the US Embassy in Yemen closed years ago, leaving Americans without access to any form of consular assistance should they get into trouble. With ongoing fighting, landmines, and little to no law enforcement presence, travelling in Yemen is not only dangerous, it is also nearly impossible to do legally. In short, Yemen is a country to avoid at all costs in 2025. The combination of armed conflict, terrorism, and lack of diplomatic support makes it a high-risk destination for any American citizen. Number 5. Venezuela. Venezuela, once one of South America's wealthiest nations, has been grappling with political instability, economic collapse, and social unrest for years. As of 2025, it remains a country where Americans face significant travel restrictions and serious risks. The US government has consistently warned against traveling to Venezuela, citing the country's deepening economic crisis, soaring crime rates, and an unstable political environment. In recent years, Venezuela has been dealing with hyperinflation, food and medicine shortages, and widespread poverty, which have led to mass protests and civil unrest. These tensions, combined with ongoing power struggles between the government and opposition groups, have created a volatile atmosphere that is far from safe for foreign travellers. For Americans, Venezuela is particularly risky due to the strained diplomatic relations between the two countries. In 2019, the US cut diplomatic ties with Venezuela and suspended most consular services, meaning that Americans have little to no support if they get into trouble. The lack of a US embassy or consular presence makes it incredibly difficult for Americans to resolve legal issues or seek assistance in an emergency. Another major concern is Venezuela's high crime rate. Violent crime, including armed robberies, kidnappings, and carjackings, is common, particularly in large cities like Caracas. Additionally, criminal gangs often operate with impunity, making personal safety a significant concern for any foreigner, especially those who stand out as Americans. While Venezuela's natural beauty and rich cultural heritage may still intrigue some travellers, the country's current instability and the lack of a US presence make it a destination that Americans should avoid in 2025. The risks simply outweigh any potential rewards. Number 4. Cuba. Cuba, with its vibrant culture, stunning beaches, and rich history, has long been a popular destination for travellers, especially those from the United States. However, despite its proximity to the US, Cuba remains a country with complex travel restrictions for Americans in 2025. The root of these restrictions lies in the ongoing political and economic tensions between the US and the Cuban government. Although relations have thawed at times, particularly during the Obama administration, the US government has maintained strict regulations regarding travel to Cuba, especially under the current administration. For American citizens, visiting Cuba isn't as simple as booking a flight. It involves navigating a maze of rules and regulations. For most US travelers, a visa is required, and travel is only allowed under specific categories. These include educational, cultural, journalistic, or humanitarian purposes, among others. Tourism, as we know it, is still technically prohibited for American citizens. The US government has also restricted financial transactions with businesses owned by the Cuban military, which includes many of the country's hotels, stores, and even certain tourist activities. This has made it more difficult for Americans to visit Cuba in the traditional sense. Another factor to consider is the challenge of finding reliable communication while in Cuba. The internet is limited, and many services are difficult to access, making it challenging to make last-minute travel changes or connect with family and friends back home. Additionally, Cuba has long faced economic struggles, and many basic services, such as healthcare, transportation, and accommodation, can be subpar. While Cuba's charm may still be alluring, the combination of strict travel regulations, political issues, and logistical difficulties make it a country where Americans should proceed with caution in 2025. Number 3. Sudan. Sudan, located in the northeastern part of Africa, has been a country marked by ongoing conflict, political instability, and humanitarian crises for years. As of 2025, Sudan remains one of the most perilous places for US citizens to visit, with travel advisories warning against any travel to the region. The US State Department has issued a Level 4 Do Not Travel advisory for Sudan, citing the country's volatile security situation. Sudan is still recovering from decades of internal conflict, including the brutal Darfur War and the recent military coup that further plunged the nation into turmoil. The country is currently in the midst of a fragile transition, with competing factions vying for power, making it an extremely unpredictable and dangerous place for travelers. The risks for Americans are particularly high due to the country's tense political atmosphere. Armed conflict continues in various regions, and violent clashes between government forces and opposition groups are common. The ongoing unrest, combined with the presence of terrorist groups, makes Sudan a hotbed for instability. Foreigners, especially US citizens, are often at risk of being caught in the crossfire or targeted for kidnapping, especially in rural and conflict-affected areas. In addition to the violence, Sudan also poses logistical challenges for travelers. The US Embassy in Khartoum is limited in its ability to assist American citizens, particularly in areas outside the capital. Communication and infrastructure are often unreliable, and access to medical care can be scarce, especially in remote parts of the country. With such high risks of violence, terrorism, and kidnapping, Sudan is a country that should be avoided by US citizens in 2025. If you're considering travel to the region, it's important to research safer alternatives. Number 2. Afghanistan. Afghanistan, once a focal point of global geopolitics, remains one of the most dangerous places for Americans to visit in 2025. Even before the US withdrawal in 2018, 2021, the country was known for its unstable security situation, but the rise of the Taliban has made travel to Afghanistan practically impossible for US citizens. Following the US military exit, the Taliban swiftly regained control of the country, creating an environment of uncertainty and chaos. The situation has been marked by ongoing violence, human rights abuses, and a rise in terrorism. Because of these threats, the US government has issued a strong advisory against any travel to Afghanistan, warning that it is too dangerous for Americans to go, regardless of the reason. What makes Afghanistan so risky? First, the country remains a hotbed of terrorist activity, with groups like ISIS-K and the Taliban targeting foreigners. Kidnapping is also a major concern. US citizens, along with other foreigners, are seen as high-value targets for ransom or political leverage. Moreover, the Taliban's oppressive regime has resulted in severe restrictions on women's rights and freedom of speech. And foreign travellers are often caught in the crossfire of internal conflicts. In addition to the physical dangers, Afghanistan lacks a stable infrastructure. The US Embassy in Kabul closed after the Taliban takeover, which means there are no diplomatic services available for Americans who might find themselves in trouble. In short, Afghanistan is not a destination that should be considered by any American traveller. The risks of violence, kidnapping, and political unrest are far too great. If you were thinking of visiting, it's better to look elsewhere for your next adventure. Number 1. Russia. Russia, once a top destination for international travellers, has rapidly become one of the most restricted and dangerous places for Americans to visit in 2025. The ongoing geopolitical tensions between the US and Russia, particularly due to the invasion of Ukraine and escalating sanctions, have led to severe travel restrictions for US citizens. Since the onset of the war in Ukraine, Russia has faced increasing isolation from the West, and the relationship between the US and Russia has deteriorated sharply. In response, the Russian government has imposed stricter visa regulations, making it more difficult for Americans to enter the country. In some cases, obtaining a visa has become nearly impossible, and the process is highly politicized, with Russian authorities often denying visa applications without clear explanations. Even if an American traveller manages to secure a visa, the conditions for entry are subject to change, leaving travellers vulnerable to sudden restrictions or expulsions. The security risks for Americans in Russia are also significant. Do not travel advisory, citing concerns over detention, harassment, and arbitrary arrests. Americans in Russia have been subjected to politically motivated detentions, with some being accused of espionage or other fabricated charges. The risk of being detained by Russian authorities, especially in light of the strained relations, is higher than ever. Additionally, with rising anti-American sentiment, Americans in Russia may be at risk of violence or targeted attacks. The lack of consular support only exacerbates the danger, as the US Embassy in Moscow is severely limited in its ability to provide assistance. For all these reasons, Russia is not a safe destination for US travellers in 2025. The combination of political hostility, legal restrictions, and security risks make it a country to avoid for American citizens. So there you have it. 10 countries where Americans are either banned or face severe restrictions in 2025. Whether it's political tensions, security risks, or diplomatic issues, these countries have made it clear that US citizens are not welcome. It's crucial to understand that travelling to these places isn't just risky. It could land you in serious legal or personal trouble. Before booking your next trip, make sure to check the latest travel advisories and restrictions from official sources. It's always better to be prepared than to be caught off guard when your passport gets rejected or you're facing unexpected dangers abroad. If you're itching to explore the world, don't worry. There are still plenty of amazing destinations where Americans are welcomed with open arms. Just be sure to do your research and plan ahead. If this video helped you stay informed and avoid potentially dangerous travel spots, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with anyone else who might find it useful. Got any experiences or questions about travel restrictions? Drop them in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there on your travels.